Hello everyone. In this lecture, we are going to familiarize ourselves with the theory of Alaṅkāra. The theory of Alaṅkāra is one of the earliest theories in Sanskrit poetics. We can say that Sanskrit literary theory was inaugurated with the theory of Alaṅkāra. Alaṅkāra being an important constituent of poetry, the word Alaṅkāra Shastra in course of time came to represent literary theory itself. In this lecture, I would like to give you only a conceptual overview of the idea of Alaṅkāra. In other words, we will not get into the definitions of individual Alaṅkāras, rather we will only see how the idea of Alaṅkāra functioned in general in poetics. There are two reasons for this crucial decision. First of all, the definitions of individual Alaṅkāras never remained static in poetics. It kept changing with new theoreticians redefining them in their works. Secondly, the time constraint of 8 weeks also limits my engagement with the theory of Alaṅkāra to only a conceptual discussion of this field. Now, let's begin with our discussion. What is an Alaṅkāra? An approximate translation of the word Alaṅkāra would be figures of speech or rhetoric. It is interesting to note that the term Alaṅkāra was used in Sanskrit poetics in two senses. First, as a specific term to signify what was conventionally regarded as figures of speech, and secondly, to denote anything that adds beauty to the poem. The word Alaṅkāra etymologically means that which creates beauty. It is derived from the Sanskrit root kr, meaning to do, with the prefix alam, which means to decorate, to adorn, etc. The idea of Alaṅkāra as an ornament implies that there is something to be ornamented. It would be logical to assume then that the thing to be ornamented is the body of the poem. Bimal Krishna Martilal is of the view that we can identify two main theories of Alaṅkāra in Sanskrit Kavya. One, which considers Alaṅkāra as the special external embellishment such as Upama, Rupaka, etc. to the body of the poem, and the other which considers it as everything that adds beauty to a poem. While the idea of ornamentation is relevant to the first theory, the second theory would consider Alaṅkāra to be beauty itself. Vamana has used it in these two senses in his Kavyalaṅkāra Sutravrti. In Kavyalaṅkāra Sutravrti, Vamana says, Kavyam Grahyam Alaṅkāra. Poetry appears to be attractive to us because of figure of speech. Here, he uses the word Alaṅkāra to refer to the idea of figure of speech. Later, he says Saundaryam Alaṅkāra. Here, he uses the word Alaṅkāra to mean beauty in general. Alaṅkāras are usually divided into two, Shabda Alaṅkāras and Artha Alaṅkāras. Shabda Alaṅkāra includes all those figures of speech that add to the auditory effect like alliteration, assonance, consonance or pun, etc. Artha Alaṅkāra is anything that enhances the meaning of a word like simile or metaphor. The difference in languages makes it difficult for us to draw exact parallels between figures of speech in Sanskrit and English, but there are similarities like the devices of upama and simile or anuprasa and alliteration. Although Bhamaha is the name closely associated with the Alaṅkāra school, Bharata was the first literary theoretician to define and illustrate Alaṅkāras. For Bharata, Alaṅkāras are four in number, namely Upama, Dipaka, Rupaka and Yamaka. Dramaturgy was the primary concern of Bharata in Natya Shastra, and so he did not analyze the idea of Alaṅkāra in great detail. Other writers before Bhamaha had often briefly talked about the idea of figures of speech in passing reference. A few examples in this respect include a chapter on Alaṅkāra in Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, which is of unknown authorship, and Bhatti Kavya, also known as Ravana Vatha by Bhatti. Vishnu Dharmottara Purana contains some 1000 verses on the topics of Natya Shastra and Alaṅkāra. Chapters 14, 15 and 16 are particularly important as far as Alaṅkāra is concerned. While chapter 14 lists and defines figures of speech in Kavya, chapter 15 distinguishes Kavya from Itihasa, and chapter 17 speaks of Rupakas and their 12 varieties. Bhatti Kavya, a poem in 22 cantos, was composed primarily for illustrating the rules of Sanskrit grammar. It is divided into 4 sections. The 4th chapter, named Prasanna Kanda, is very important from the perspective of Alaṅkāra. It deals with poetics and illustrates 39 Alaṅkāras. The order in which Alaṅkāras are arranged is the same as their order in Bhamaha's Kavya Alaṅkāra, although Bhatti deviates in a few cases from Bhamaha. Another major work that deals with Alaṅkāra in passing is Agni Purana. Chapters 328 to 47 of Agni Purana deals with figures of speech such as Yamaka, Chitra, Upama, Rupaka, Sahokti, Arthandarinyasa, Utpreksha, Adishya, Vibhavana, Virodha and Hetu. In Sanskrit literary theory, Bhamaha can be considered the first literary theoretician to systematically deal with the question of Alaṅkāra. He implicitly accepted that Alaṅkāra constitutes the very nature of poetry. We know almost nothing about Bhamaha other than the fact that he could have been a Buddhist and a contemporary of Dandin. Bhamaha's magnum opus is Kavya Alaṅkāra. In Kavya Alaṅkāra, Bhamaha primarily focused on the various categories of Alaṅkāras or figures of speech to understand the very nature of poetic language. Other than Kavya Alaṅkāra, he is supposed to have written Prakrit Manorama, a commentary on Vararuchi's Prakrit work. Bhamaha is often considered the founding father of Sanskrit poetics, and the fact that later theoreticians like Anandavardhana and Abhinavagupta caught him with respect is evidence enough of his stature in the field. The following are the 39 Alaṅkāras mentioned by Bhamaha, and these Alaṅkāras include Anuprasa, Yamaka, Rupaka, Deepaka, Pradivastuta Upama, Aksheba, Arthandharanyasa, Vyatireka, Vibhavana, Samasokti, Adishayokti, Yathasamkhya, Utpreksha, Preyas, Rasavat, Urjasvi, Prayokta, Samahita, Udatta, Slishta, Apahnudi, Visheshokti, Virodha, Tulya Yogyata, Aprastuta Prasamsa, Vyajastudi, Nidarshana, Upama Rupaka, Upameyopama, Sahokti, Parivritti, Ananvaya, Sasandeha, Utprekshavayava, Samsrishti, Bhavika, Ashis, Swabhavokti. Bhamaha mentions 39 Alaṅkāras, but it should be noted that if we include the subdivisions of the Alaṅkāras, then it will come to around 49. We will see that the number of Alaṅkāras increasing in the works of later writers. For example, Bhoja in his Saraswati Kandabharana enumerates 72 Alaṅkāras. He divides the Alaṅkāras into Shabda Alaṅkāras, Artha Alaṅkāras and Ubhaya Alaṅkāras. In each category he mentions some 24 Alaṅkāras. Mammata in Kavya Prakasha mentions some 67 Alaṅkāras. In Sahitya Darpana, Vishwanatha counts 77 Artha Alankaras and 7 Shabda Alankaras. For Ruyaga, the number of Alankaras is 80. Jayadeva in Chandraloka mentions 100 Alankaras. In Appaya Dikshida's Kuvalayananda, the number of Alankaras finally reaches 150. This ever-increasing number of Alankaras shows simultaneously the growth of poetry as well as that of poetics. One can undoubtedly say that Bhamaha's observations about the idea of Alaṅkāra became the foundation for other literary theoreticians to build their theories on Alaṅkāra further. The most important observation of Bhamaha vis-a-vis the theory of Alaṅkāra was that the soul of Alaṅkāra, all the Alaṅkāras, is the quality called Vakrokti, or the figurative deviation from the ordinary expression. He says that the Alaṅkāra called Atishayokti or hyperbole and the quality of Vakrokti or figurative deviation from mundane expressions are the same. According to Bhamaha, Atishayokti is the treatment of an object or idea in such a way that it appears strikingly new to the readers. In other words, in the figure of speech called Atishayokti, an object or entity transcends our familiar equations of perceiving it. Many scholars have brought this peculiar nature of Atishayokti to our notice. According to Dandin, Atishayokti is that great Alaṅkāra where signification or vivaksha moves beyond the borders of common perception. According to Utpada, Atishayokti is a statement which surpasses the common perception of people. Utpada divided Atishayokti into 4 varieties: imposition of sameness where there is difference in reality, imagining difference where there is really no difference, describing some imaginary thing which is really impossible, and the reversion of cause and effect to show quickness of effect. In all these varieties of Atishayokti, the ultimate aim is to shatter the reader's common perception about an object or idea. According to Bhamaha, Atishayokti is identical with Vakrokti or deviant utterance, and all poets should take special care to master this art of deviant utterance. In Kavya Alaṅkāra, Bhamaha says, this Atishayokti is nothing but Vakrokti, all meanings appear new by this. Poets should be assiduous in cultivating it. Where is an Alaṅkāra without this? Bhamaha says that ordinary expressions which reproduce the dominant way we perceive entities without any figurative deviation or Vakrokti should not be considered an Alaṅkāra, and the matter of fact expressions bereft of Vakrokti are mere Varta or report, not Kavya. Bhamaha observes that expressions such as the sun has set, the moon shines, the birds are winging back to their nests do not turn out to be a poem. He asks, what kind of poetry is this? This is called Varta. The following is an example of Atishayokti which Bhamaha cites in Kavya Alaṅkāra. If the loose skin of water drops down like the slough of serpents, then it will become the white garments on the limbs of ladies spotting on in the water. In this example, Bhamaha gives us a deviant and the hitherto unfamiliar equation of perceiving water. The dominant conception about water is that it is a colorless, odorless liquid which forms water bodies such as river, ocean, pond and so on. By considering water as a white garb on the limbs of ladies playing in the water, Bhamaha is altering the dominant conception about water. Matilal observes that in Bhamaha's slightly loose terminology, Vakrokti is equal to Atishayokti, Atishayokti is equal to Alaṅkāra. Holding Vakrokti in high esteem, Bhamaha is reluctant to consider Swabhavokti, or the act of presenting something in the way it is commonly perceived, as an Alaṅkāra. While describing the 5 kinds of Kavya, Bhamaha reiterates that Kavya in any form becomes commentable only if it is characterized by deviant utterance. For him, a composition which is clear, smooth and elegant but devoid of deviant utterance will be mere music, not kavya. Bhamaha does not give the status of alankara to figures of speech such as hetu, sukshma and lesha, citing the reason that they do not have the quality of adishayokti in them. The observation of Bhamaha was later accepted by Anandavardhana in his Dhvanyaloka. Ananda expresses his agreement with the view of Bhamaha by verbatim reproducing the words of Bhamaha in Alaṅkāra. Abhinavagupta further agrees with the observation of Bhamaha in his Lojana on Anandavardhana's Dhvanyaloka. Abhinava says, that which has been defined as hyperbole is the whole of figure of speech. That is, every sort of figure of speech, for Bhamaha has said. An unusual or striking form of word or meaning, Vakrokti, is considered an ornament, alaṅkāri, of poetic utterance. For the bent, Vakra, form of a word or of a meaning is its presentation in an unusual or striking form, and this constitutes the ornament of a figure of speech. Now, hyperbole is precisely the property of being unusual or striking. Hence, hyperbole is a common property of all figures of speech. Thus, it is by this hyperbole that a meaning which has been worn out by everyone's use of it can be given new variety and interest. In Vakrokti Jivita, Kuntaka also repeats the same observation. For him, adishayokti, which is the very life force of all ornaments of kavya, is present in all sorts of vakrata. He calls adishayokti sarva alankara jividam. The term adishayokti in this context should not be understood in its limited sense as an individual alankara, but in its broader sense as an experience of surprise. The term adishayokti in Sanskrit is composed of two words, adishaya and ukti, meaning respectively surprise and speech. So the term adishayokti in its etymological sense means any linguistic expression which causes surprise in the reader or spectator. It is not surprising that Kuntaka, who espoused Vakrokti, should agree that the essence of poetry is alankara or ornamental speech, which differs from ordinary use of language. According to Kuntaka, swabhavokti, or the presentation of an idea or entity in the way they are popularly presented or perceived in the society, is not an alankara at all. According to Kuntaka, what makes a linguistic composition a kavya or literary artifact is always the presence of alankara, and the only alankara or ornament that can adorn a poem is Vakrokti. What Kuntaka means by this statement is that Vakrokti is the essence of all alankaras and there is no alankara without it. Kuntaka says, these two, sound and sense, which constitute a poem, are alankaryas, things that are to be decorated. They are to be embellished by some alankaras. What should function as the ornament of these two? It is none other than deviant utterance or Vakrokti. Vakrokti is that signification which is different from the popular usage. This is what I am driving at. In kavya, both sound and sense have separate existence. We are not adorning them with different alankaras. What serves as their ornament is their presentation in a deviant manner. Only this can cause beauty in poetry. Considering figurative deviation or vakrata as the vital component of kavya, Kuntaka says that swabhavokti, or the presentation of an idea or entity in the way they are popularly presented or perceived in the society, does not have any space within the ambit of kavya. Kuntaka presents his opponent's view that Swabhavokti is an alankara to systematically refute it. Here is an opponent's view. It has been stated by you, that is Kuntaka, that Vakrokti is the only alankara and nothing other than Vakrokti is an alankara. Why do you say so? The ancient alankarikas or literary theoreticians have clearly stated that there is an alankara called Swabhavokti. This figure of speech is very charming. To refute this observation, I, that is Kuntaka, say so. Those alankarikas who say that Swabhavokti is an alankara are undoubtedly immature. What is Swabhavokti? It is the act of stating the nature of objects in the way they exist in the world. If that is an alankara, then what can be used to decorate it to become the body of kavya? We have seen that Swabhavokti is the act of reproducing ideas and entities in the way they are dominantly perceived and presented in the world. The primary problem underpinning Swabhavokti is that it always goads the creative writers to verbatim reproduce an already existing familiar pattern of perception, thereby leaving little space for the author to be creative and original. As opposed to simply recreating what is generally considered the identity of an entity or a thing or swabhava, Kuntaka is concerned with the creative transformation of the existing structures, and he never aims to reproduce the known and the familiar. Kuntaka opines that the task of a poet is to portray the world differently through vakrata or deviation from what is familiar, as opposed to confining to the familiar equations of perception or swabhava. He clarifies his stand further. This is the gist of what I have said. The objects that poets describe are not newly created on earth. Poets impart ordinary objects a sublime and non-ordinary form. They are elevated to such a rare position where they appeal to the hearts of the responsive readers or sahridaya. Thus, poets transform ordinary entities into a non-ordinary and rare state. In this way, the objects that are described transcend the habitual way they have so far been perceived, and they shine forth as if they are absolutely new entities and ultimately steal our hearts. This is why poets are called creators, as it is stated by Anandavardhana, in the endless world of poetry, poet is the only Lord. The whole world transforms at his will. In Kuntaka's poetic theory, if a statement wants to attain the status of an alankara and consequently that of a kavya, it should always be characterized by vakrata. While Swabhavokti is a habitual act of representing an object in the same way it has been dominantly conceived and never aims to explore the hitherto unseen facets of an entity, Vakrokti is a creative act that aims to transcend the habitual structures of perception. We can undoubtedly say that Kuntaka is an important figure in the history of Alankara theory. S.K. Dey's observation about the contribution of Kuntaka is absolutely noteworthy in this context. According to Dey, Alaṅkāra system established by Bhamaha was given a new turn by Kuntaka. In fact, Vakrokti system of Kuntaka may properly be regarded as an offshoot of the older Alaṅkāra system. In spite of the obviously extreme nature of his central theory and his somewhat quaint nomenclature, his work is of great value as presenting a unique system, or rather systematizing the Alaṅkāra theory of earlier writers in a refreshing original way. Kuntaka clarified and vindicated his position by pointing out that the correct term for the figure is not just Alaṅkāra, the ornament or figure of speech, but it is Kavya Alaṅkāra, the poetic figure. Therefore, Vakratva, Vaichitya, which is a peculiar turn of expression depending on Kavi Vyapara, differentiates a poetic figure. This is the significant original contribution of Kuntaka to Sanskrit poetics. He says this in his History of Sanskrit Poetics. But this emphasis on Atishayokti was not shared by all critics. Dandin, who is the second most influential exponent of Alaṅkāra school, particularly disagreed with Bhamaha's observation that Varta or report cannot serve as an ornament of poetry. Dandin employed the term Swabhavokti to designate what Bhamaha calls Varta. According to Dandin, Swabhavokti is a figure of speech. This is in fact the first Alaṅkāra he deals with in his Kavyadarsha. He maintained that Swabhavokti, which is also found abundantly in Shastras, is well appreciated by connoisseurs of art as an Alaṅkāra. At this juncture, I would also like to point out that in Bhamaha's theory, the idea of Rasa was also relegated to the position of a figure of speech. We will see this concept in detail when we discuss the theory of Rasa in the following classes. Although the idea of Rasa was an important point of discussion in Natya Shastra and was well known to literary critics from Bhamaha onwards, none of the literary theoreticians or alankarikas until Utpada considered it to be a criterion for literariness or an independent category. For them, Rasa was clearly subordinate to a larger discourse on figures. It did not constitute the heart of the literariness. Bhamaha subsumes the idea of Rasa under three verbal expressions of emotions, such as Rasavat or Rasa-laden expression, Prayaha or affectionate utterance, and Urjasvin or haughty declaration. Like Bhamaha before him, Dandin also reserved no special category for Rasa other than that of figuration. In Dandin's Kavyadarsha, the idea of Rasa is used in two different senses. First, as a general term for any deviant linguistic expression, and secondly, as a technical term for various instances of affective expressions such as Rasavat, Prayaha and Urjasvin. In Utpada's critical corpus also, the idea of Rasa largely remained as a figure of speech. By adding quiescent or samahita to the already existing categories of Prayaha, the affectionate utterance, Rasavat, the Rasa-laden utterance, and Urjasvin, the haughty speech, Utpada increased the number of Rasa-related figures from 3 to 4. He also mentions the components conducive for the production of Rasa, namely Vibhava or foundational factor, Anubhava or stimulant factor, Vyabhijari Bhava or transitory emotion, Sthayi Bhava or stable emotion, and Swashabda or proper name. For all these literary theoreticians, the idea of Rasa is precisely a figure of speech. It is with Anandavardhana's Dhvanyaloka that the idea of Rasa makes its way to literary criticism as a prominent constituent of literariness. According to Anandavardhana, among all the three varieties of Dhvani, it is just this meaning, that is Rasadhvani, that is the soul of poetry. For Bhamaha, it is the presence of alankaras or figures of speech that beautifies language and makes it literary as opposed to ordinary. He defined Kavya as a combination of Shabda and Artha. Shabda alankaras and Artha alankaras collectively generate poetic beauty or literariness in Kavya. It is significant to note that there were two major views regarding the body of Kavya in Sanskrit poetics. The first view was that Kavya was solely a product of Artha or signification, and second that Kavya was constituted exclusively by Shabda or signifier. Bhamaha talked about these two camps at great length in his Kavyalaṅkāra. According to Bhamaha, the first camp argued that Vibhavas etc., which produce Rasa in Kavya, dependent upon Artha. Therefore, alankaras that relate to Artha or sense are the cause of poetic beauty. Reproducing the argument of this camp, Bhamaha says, some Alamkarikas vehemently maintain that only Rupaka etc. constitute Kavya's ornaments, because a damsel's face, though beautiful, does not shine if it should be devoid of ornaments. Here the expression Alaṅkāra denotes Artha Alaṅkāras. The second camp, on the other hand, claimed that only figures of speech pertaining to sound constitute poetic beauty. Some people are of the opinion that figures of speech like Rupaka are external. They maintain that the proper disposition of nouns and verbs constitute the real ornaments of speech. The argument of this school is that the beauty of a poem lies primarily in the ornaments of sound. Bhamaha, who wished to strike a balance between these two views, maintained that poetry is the combination of both word and meaning. Poetry is the combination of both sound and sense. Shabdarthau Sahitau Kavyam. He was also the first literary theoretician to distinguish between Shabda Alaṅkāras and Artha Alaṅkāras. Though literary theoreticians invented new linguistic components and considered them to be the soul of Kavya, Alaṅkāra continued to occupy an important role in Kavya Shastra. For instance, Vamana, despite his predilection for the idea of guna, maintained that a poem without Alaṅkāra will not appeal to the minds of readers. According to him, while gunas make a poem charming, Alaṅkāra adds to poetic beauty. According to Kuntaka, there is no poetry without figures of speech. Hemachandra listed Alaṅkāra as an important constituent of poetry along with Shabda, Artha and Guna. For Vagbhata too, Kavya is a linguistic composition marked by the presence of Shabda, Artha, Gunas and finally Alaṅkāras. In Chandraloka, Jayadeva opined that Kavya is that special expression characterized by the absence of doshas and the presence of Alaṅkāra along with other poetic devices. Vidyanatha in Prataparudriya saw Kavya as that kind of Gadya or prose and Padya or poetry which is adorned by Guna, Alaṅkāra, Shabda and Artha and is bereft of doshas. At this juncture, it is important to mention the debate between Jayadeva and Mammata on the question of whether Alaṅkāra is an important constituent for Kavya. Jayadeva criticized Mammata for making Alaṅkāra only an optional element in Kavya. Mammata observed that this, that is Kavya, is the composition of word and meaning without false qualities and sometimes without figures of speech. Criticizing Mammata's stance, Jayadeva asks, why does not that great scholar who considers a composition without Alaṅkāra as a Kavya opine that the fire is bereft of heat? Anandavardhana's Dhvanyaloka marked a turning point in this extended discussion of figures of speech and rhetoric. For the first time in the history of Kavya Shastra, critical attention shifted from figures of speech and tropes to aesthetic emotion or rasa. This does not mean that Alaṅkāra lost its importance completely. Alaṅkāra, as opposed to being the central concern of theoretical engagement or analysis, was relegated to the position of a subsidiary yet important category. Ananda's observation bears testimony to it. According to Ananda, Alaṅkāras function like ornaments on a person's body, while gunas are like qualities such as courage. According to Anandavardhana, Alaṅkāras are countless in number. He is of the view that if carefully used, Alaṅkāras can greatly add to the beauty of rasas. Ananda observed that the employment of figure of speech in poetry should appear natural and spontaneous. It should be in conjunction with the rasa it aims to arouse. Any use of Alaṅkāras by force can only destroy the beauty of a poem. Only a figure which naturally occurs to the author during his or her preoccupation with rasa can befit the poem. His discussion of Alaṅkāra in Dhvanyaloka is primarily in connection with the aesthetic emotion of the erotic or Shrungara rasa. Ananda points out that Shabda Alaṅkāras or figures of speech pertaining to sound such as Yamaka can in fact mar the beauty of Shrungara rasa. Yamaka, where phonetically identical duplicates are repeated, demands conscious effort on the part of the author, which might result in deviating his or her attention away from the main aim of evocation of rasa. Ananda further says, a great poem can produce with a single effort some matters that contain rasa together with figures of speech. But for composing yamakas and the like, he must make a separate effort even if he is well able to compose them. Therefore, these figures cannot play a part subordinate to rasa. Despite occupying a central position in the discussion of poetics, Alaṅkāra often came with what appears to be a statutory warning not to employ it to excess. Anandavardhana repeatedly emphasized the need to subordinate alaṅkāras to the rasa that they should help in producing. Anandavardhana exhorted poets to exercise some meksha or discrimination in the use of alaṅkāras and formulated the following principles to be adhered to and followed by with respect to alaṅkāra. The first one goes like this: alaṅkāra must be ancillary or angabhuta. They must never become main or pradhana or angin. The main theme shall always be kept in view, and figures in consequence must be taken and thrown away in accordance with the requirements of the main idea. They must not be too much elaborated or overworked. Even if they are worked out, a good poet must take care to give them, on the whole, the position of anga only.